She wasn't just lying there. She was barely breathing. The morning light bathed the cracked pavement in a soft glow, but there was nothing soft about the sight of her. A German shepherd, her fur matted with dirt and dried blood, lay motionless by the side of the road. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, a haunting rhythm that hinted at her will to survive. People walked by, some glancing her way with pity, others pretending not to notice. It wasn't their problem. Until it was. Carol Simmons was running late that day, her coffee still steaming in the cup holder as she swerved into the grocery store parking lot. She didn't expect to find a wounded dog between the cars, much less one whose amber eyes met hers with a mixture of fear and desperation. "She's hurt," Carol murmured, as if saying it out loud made it less horrifying. It would have been easier to drive away. Instead, she crouched down. Sadie flinched, her ears pinned back, and a low growl rumbled from her throat. But Carol didn't move. She sat cross-legged on the asphalt, talking in a low, steady voice. "I'm not here to hurt you, girl. I just want to help." Minutes passed. A few more people stopped to watch, but no one stepped forward. Slowly, painfully, Sadie inched closer. She was too weak to fight, too tired to care. Carol didn't have a plan. What do you do with a bleeding, half-starved dog? A quick search on her phone told her that the nearest vet clinic was 15 minutes away. The real question was, could Sadie survive the ride? The answer came in the form of a shaky wag of Sadie's tail. Carol took it as a yes. Lifting Sadie into the car, Carol noticed something. A faded collar, frayed at the edges. The tag was missing, but etched into the leather was a name. Sadie. Sadie. She whispered it softly, and for a fleeting moment, the dog's eyes flickered with recognition. As the car sped toward the vet, Carol couldn't shake the feeling that Sadie's story was far from ordinary. Who had abandoned her? And why? The answers, she would soon discover, were darker than she imagined. Sadie hadn't always known pain. There was a time when her days were filled with joy, bounding through fields, chasing sticks, and basking in the sun. She had belonged to a family. Not just any family, but one that once adored her. The boy, Ethan, had been her closest companion. He was 8 when Sadie came into his life, a wiggly pup with ears too big for her head and a boundless energy that matched his. They were inseparable. Sadie slept at the foot of his bed, licked away his tears when he cried, and stood guard when he fell ill. The bond they shared was unbreakable, or so it seemed. As Sadie grew older, things changed. Ethan's father, Mark, had never been fond of her. He tolerated her presence for Ethan's sake, but his patience was thin. He complained about the fur, the barking, the cost of food and vet bills. "Dogs are a nuisance," Mark would mutter, his tone sharp, cutting through the warmth of the home. Ethan's mother, Claire, tried to defend Sadie, but the arguments grew louder, more frequent. Sadie began to notice the tension, the way Mark's voice rose whenever she came into the room, the way Ethan clung to her tighter after every fight. And then one day Ethan was gone. It wasn't a dramatic event, no tragic accident or tearful goodbye. Ethan had simply moved away, sent to live with Claire's sister in another state after a bitter divorce. Sadie didn't understand. She waited by the door for weeks, her ears perking up at every sound, her tail wagging in hopeful anticipation. But Ethan never came back. Mark's resentment grew. Without Ethan to advocate for her, Sadie became an inconvenience, a living reminder of a family that had fallen apart. One chilly autumn evening, Mark loaded Sadie into his truck. She wagged her tail, eager for the rare outing. She didn't notice the anger in his eyes or the set of his jaw. They drove for what felt like hours, the landscape blurring into a mix of shadow and headlights. When the truck finally stopped, Sadie's excitement turned to confusion. They were in an unfamiliar neighborhood, the streets empty and silent. Mark opened the door and said, "Get out." Sadie hesitated, her instincts telling her something was wrong. Mark's voice grew harsher. "Out," he shouted, shoving her roughly to the ground. She stumbled but didn't fight back. Her amber eyes searched his face, pleading for understanding. But Mark didn't look back as he drove away, leaving her alone in the dark. Carol stared at the road ahead, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. Sadie lay curled on the passenger seat, her body trembling despite the blanket Carol had draped over her. The vet clinic came into view, a beacon of hope in the early morning haze. Carol pulled into the parking lot, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of Sadie's frail body and the faded collar that bore her name. "What happened to you, girl?" she whispered. Sadie didn't respond, of course, but her eyes told a story of love lost, of trust betrayed, and of a resilience that refused to be extinguished. Inside the clinic, the staff sprang into action. They examined Sadie with gentle hands, murmuring reassurances as they cleaned her wounds and ran tests. "She's malnourished," the vet said, frowning. "And those cuts, they're not accidental. Someone did this to her." Carol's stomach churned. How could anyone hurt such a gentle creature? "She'll recover," the vet continued, "but it'll take time. Physically and emotionally." Carol nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll take care of her, whatever it takes." As the vet handed Carol a list of care instructions, something caught her eye. A small, almost invisible scar on Sadie's neck, just above the collar line. It was too precise to be from an accident. "What's that?" Carol asked, pointing to the mark. The vet hesitated. Could be from a tag, or something worse. Hard to say. Carol's heart sank. It was another piece of the puzzle, another fragment of a story she didn't yet understand. Back at home, as Sadie began her slow recovery, Carol couldn't stop wondering about the scar, the collar, and the life Sadie had lived before. The answers, she knew, wouldn't come easily, but she was determined to find them. The first few days were the hardest. Back home, Carol set up a quiet space in the corner of her living room, complete with a soft bed, bowls of fresh water, and carefully measured food. Sadie stayed there, curled into a tight ball, her body tense and her eyes watchful. Carol moved slowly, speaking in a soft, sing-song tone that masked her own uncertainty. Every small gesture, placing a treat nearby, sitting on the floor instead of the couch, offering a hand without expecting anything in return, was an invitation to trust. Sadie, however, was reluctant. Her amber eyes followed Carol's every move, cautious but curious. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Carol whispered one evening, sitting cross-legged a few feet away. "Take your time, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." It was a small moment, a flicker almost imperceptible. Carol had been sitting quietly, reading aloud from an old book, when Sadie shifted. For the first time, she stretched her legs out of the tight ball she always curled into. "Good girl," Carol said softly, not daring to move. Sadie's tail gave the faintest wag. It was hesitant, almost as if she didn't remember how to do it. But it was a start. Over the next week, the progress was slow but steady. Sadie began eating regularly, though she still avoided eye contact. She started exploring the house at night when she thought Carol wouldn't notice. The first time Carol woke up to find Sadie standing at her bedside, staring at her with those deep, searching eyes, she fought back tears. "Hey girl," she murmured, reaching out a hand. Sadie hesitated, her nose twitching, then leaned in ever so slightly to sniff Carol's fingers. It was the first real connection. On the 10th day, Carol decided it was time for a walk. She wasn't sure how Sadie would react, but she knew staying indoors forever wasn't an option. The leash, however, was a challenge. The sight of it made Sadie freeze, her ears pinning back. Carol dropped it immediately, crouching to Sadie's level. "I won't hurt you," she said gently. "This isn't a punishment. It's just for safety. We'll go slow, okay?" It took half an hour of patience and a handful of treats, but Sadie eventually allowed Carol to clip the leash to her collar. They stepped outside together, the cool morning air crisp and refreshing. Sadie was nervous, her tail tucked and her steps hesitant. But as they moved down the quiet street, something shifted. A bird chirped from a nearby tree, and Sadie's ears perked up. A squirrel darted across the sidewalk, and for a moment her body tensed. Not in fear, but in instinct. Carol smiled. "There you are, girl. You're still in there." As they rounded the corner, they passed a small park where a group of children were playing. One boy, no older than 10, ran toward them, his face lighting up at the sight of Sadie. "Can I pet her?" he asked eagerly. Carol hesitated. "She's a little shy, but you can try. Just go slow." The boy crouched down, holding out his hand. Sadie froze, her body rigid. Carol was about to intervene when something unexpected happened. Sadie stepped forward. Her nose touched the boy's hand, and her tail gave a cautious wag. The boy beamed. "She's so soft," he said, gently stroking her fur. For the first time, Carol saw a glimpse of the dog Sadie used to be, the one who loved unconditionally, the one who believed in the goodness of people. That evening, Sadie followed Carol into the living room for the first time. She didn't retreat to her corner. Instead, she lay at Carol's feet, her head resting on her paws. Carol reached down, brushing her fingers through Sadie's fur. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. "We're both going to be okay." Sadie let out a deep sigh, her body relaxing fully for the first time since she arrived. It wasn't a victory. It was a milestone. A small but significant step toward healing. As Sadie grew more comfortable, Carol couldn't help but notice the little clues Sadie carried with her. The scar on her neck, the way she flinched at certain sounds, and the sadness in her eyes that seemed too deep for words. The past wasn't done with them yet. Weeks passed, and Sadie began to settle into her new life. Her coat grew shinier, her wounds healed, and her steps became less tentative. She no longer flinched at sudden noises or avoided eye contact. Every evening, Carol and Sadie developed a routine. A quiet walk through the neighborhood, followed by a cozy night on the couch. Sadie would lay her head on Carol's lap, her eyes half closed, finally at peace. But there were moments when the shadows of Sadie's past crept back. Loud voices on television made her retreat to her corner. The sight of a man wearing a baseball cap caused her to growl low in her throat. And then there was the scar on her neck, a constant reminder of something Carol couldn't explain. One afternoon, while brushing Sadie's coat, Carol's fingers grazed the small, precise scar just above her collarbone. Her curiosity, which she had tried to suppress, finally got the better of her. "Let's figure this out," Carol murmured, pulling out her laptop. She typed in every combination of phrases she could think of. Dog scar near collar, abandoned shepherd injuries, dog with unusual mark. Among the results was an article about dogs used for illegal activities, fighting, breeding, or even tracking devices. Carol's stomach turned. Could Sadie have been part of something dark before she was abandoned? Determined to uncover the truth, Carol visited the local animal shelter. She brought Sadie along, hoping someone might recognize her. She was abandoned near Pinewood, Carol explained to the receptionist, showing them a photo of Sadie's faded collar. "There's a scar on her neck, too. It looks intentional." The shelter manager, a gruff but kind woman named Deborah, frowned as she examined the photo. "I've seen marks like that before. Sometimes it's from an embedded microchip that wasn't placed correctly." "A microchip?" Carol repeated. Deborah nodded. "It's worth checking. If she was chipped, we can trace her back to her original owner." The idea both excited and terrified Carol. At the vet's office, the scan was quick but revealing. "She's chipped," the vet confirmed, his tone cautious. "But this isn't a standard identification chip. It's older, not something we see often anymore. I'll have to contact the database for more details." The waiting was excruciating. Sadie sat beside Carol, her head resting on her knee, seemingly unaware of the weight of the moment. When the vet returned, his expression was unreadable. "Her chip traces back to a breeder in another state," he said. "It looks like she was sold to a family about 6 years ago." Carol's heart sank. "Do you have their information?" "I can give you their last registered address," the vet replied. Carol hesitated. Did she really want to know? The answers she sought could bring clarity, but they could also bring pain, for both her and Sadie. That evening, Carol opened a box she had kept since the day she brought Sadie home. Inside were the few items Sadie had come with: her faded collar, a blanket, and a single torn photograph she had found tucked into the folds of the blanket. The photo showed a young boy, no older than 10, hugging a German shepherd puppy. The boy's smile was wide and full of love, and the puppy's ears were too big for her head. a telltale sign of Sadie as a pup. Carol traced her fingers over the image. "Who are you and what happened to you?" she whispered. Carol couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were within reach. She dialed the number linked to the breeder's records, her heart pounding with each ring. A woman answered, her voice cautious but kind. "This is Claire Reynolds." Carol hesitated, then explained the situation. "I think I have your dog, Sadie. She was abandoned, and I found her badly injured. I just want to know what happened." The line went silent. When Claire spoke again, her voice was trembling. "Sadie, I thought she was dead." Over the phone, Claire recounted the heartbreaking truth. Sadie had been her son Ethan's dog. They had raised her together, but after her divorce, Claire couldn't keep Sadie. She left her with Ethan's father, Mark, hoping he would care for her. But Mark hated her, Claire admitted, her voice breaking. "I didn't know until it was too late. He got rid of her, and I didn't have the resources to find her." Carol's heart ached with anger and sadness. "Is Ethan?" Carol started to ask but stopped herself. "He's grown now," Claire said softly, "but he still talks about her. He always wondered if she was okay." Carol hung up, her emotions swirling. She had found part of the truth, but there was still one question left unanswered. Would reuniting Sadie with her past bring healing or more pain? The decision weighed heavily on her, and the choice she made would change everything. Carol sat on the couch, Sadie's head resting heavily on her lap. The conversation with Claire replayed in her mind, the weight of the decision pressing on her. Should she reunite Sadie with her past? Could it bring healing to Ethan, or would it risk undoing all the progress Sadie had made? "Girl, what do we do?" Carol whispered, running her fingers gently over Sadie's fur. Sadie sighed, a deep, contented breath that seemed to say she was happy here, now. But Carol couldn't ignore the torn photograph, the microchip scar, or the memories Sadie carried in her eyes. The past wasn't something she could bury. It was something she had to face. The next morning, Carol called Claire again. "I've been thinking," Carol began hesitantly. "Would Ethan want to see Sadie?" Claire's voice wavered. "He's always hoped she was out there somewhere. It might be hard for him, but I think it would mean the world to him." They arranged to meet at a park halfway between their towns. Carol felt a mixture of hope and dread as the day approached. The park was quiet, the crisp fall air filled with the sound of rustling leaves. Carol sat on a bench with Sadie at her side, her leash slack in Carol's hand. Across the field, a car pulled up, and a young man stepped out. He was in his early 20s, tall and lean, with a tentative smile that wavered as he spotted Sadie. "Ethan," Claire said softly, stepping out behind him. Ethan froze, his eyes locking onto Sadie. She looked up, her ears perking slightly. For a moment, it seemed as if time stood still. "Sadie," Ethan's voice cracked. Sadie hesitated, her body tense. Then, as if something deep within her awoke, she took a cautious step forward. Her tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster until it was a blur. Ethan knelt down, tears streaming down his face. "Sadie, it's me," he whispered. In an instant, Sadie was running toward him, her leash slipping from Carol's fingers. She leapt into Ethan's arms, her tail wagging furiously as she licked his face. Carol watched, her own tears spilling over. For the first time, Sadie seemed like the carefree, happy dog she was always meant to be. The reunion was bittersweet. As they sat together, Ethan recounted his memories of Sadie, his voice filled with love and regret. "I never wanted to leave her," he said, his hands gently stroking Sadie's head. "I begged my dad to let me take her, but he wouldn't let me. I didn't know what he'd do." Carol nodded, understanding the pain in his voice. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong, and she's finally starting to heal." Ethan looked at Carol, his expression conflicted. "I don't know what to do. I want to take her home, but she seems so happy with you." The question hung in the air. Who did Sadie belong to now? That night, Carol wrestled with her emotions. She had grown to love Sadie deeply, and the thought of letting her go was unbearable. But could she deny Ethan the chance to be reunited with the dog he had loved and lost? The next day, she called Claire. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. At their next meeting, Carol arrived with Sadie by her side. Ethan was waiting, his eyes filled with hope. Carol knelt down and hugged Sadie tightly, her voice breaking as she spoke. "You'll always be my girl," she whispered. She handed the leash to Ethan, her heart shattering even as she smiled. "Take care of her," she said, her voice trembling. "She deserves the best." Ethan nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for everything." As they walked away, Sadie looked back at Carol. For a moment, Carol thought she would run back to her. But then Sadie turned and followed Ethan, her tail wagging with a newfound confidence. Weeks passed, and the house felt unbearably quiet without Sadie. Carol tried to focus on her work, her hobbies, but nothing filled the void. One rainy afternoon, there was a knock at the door. When Carol opened it, Ethan stood there with Sadie by his side. "I couldn't do it," Ethan said, his voice steady. "She's happy with you. She kept looking for you, even when we were home. I think you're her home now." Sadie bounded into the house, her tail wagging furiously as she leapt into Carol's arms. As Carol watched Sadie settle back into her corner, she felt a mix of emotions: joy, relief, and a lingering sadness. The story wasn't neat or simple. It was filled with pain and healing, loss and love. Sadie's past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found a new family, a new life, and a second chance. And for Carol, Sadie was more than a dog. She was a reminder of resilience, of the power of love, and of the unexpected ways life can bring us exactly what we need. The camera fades out as Carol sits on the couch, Sadie curled at her feet. The rain taps gently against the window, a soothing rhythm that mirrors the peace in the room. Sadie lifts her head, her amber eyes meeting the camera. For a moment, it feels as if she's looking directly at the viewer, her gaze filled with a quiet wisdom. Some questions will never have answers, but perhaps Carol thought that was the beauty of it.